All right. Good morning here from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon to Africa and Europe, and good evening to Asia. Hello to everyone, wherever you are in the world at the moment. Let me first say that this session will be recorded, and questions can be fielded through the Q&A function during the webinar. On behalf of the Liberal International and the National Democratic Institute, I welcome you all to this panel. This coming hour, we will be debriefing the outcomes of the COP28 and set the agenda for the road to the COP29. My name is Birgitta Ohlsson. I will be moderating this session. Since April 2020, I'm the director of the political parties team at the National Democratic Institute, NDI. And my own experience comes from political parties, actually from the Liberal family, so it feels like coming home being here today. Between 2002 and 2018, I was a member of the Swedish Parliament, and I spent 5 years as the minister in the Swedish government for European affairs and democracy. And with me here today, I have two excellent global climate experts, Hakima you are not only the president of the Liberal International, but also the former Minister for Environment of Climate in Morocco and the United Nations climate champion, always giving the global majority countries a strong voice. And Lauren van Metre, my dear colleague at NDI. Lauren is the director of the Peace, Climate and Democratic Resilience team at the National Democratic Institute. Dr. van Metre has background at the Pentagon, the State Department, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Atlantic Council. And she has published frequently on issues of governance and fragility, including most recently on climate issues, solving the failure of governments to respond to the climate crisis. We know now that the dust has settled around the COP28, and 3 months have passed since the UN Climate Change Conference. The aftermath of these conferences are always characterized by mixed emotions, I would say. Too little, too late, some people would say. We reached what was possible at the moment. Other ones would mention it could have been far worse, another category would say. Voices that are both super disappointed and more accepting of certain realities. So I would like to start off by giving our panelists, Lauren van Metre and Hakima Ohlsson, a chance to share their impressions of the COP28 and maybe explain a bit the crisis in climate governance and the way forward for climate justice for developing nations and future generations. Who would like to start off?
Lauren.
Lauren, please start. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you both. Before I begin, I sincerely want to thank the Liberal International for hosting this event today and for their commitment and work on climate, Hakima, under your leadership. A sincere thanks to Irene Wang for all her organization and Birgitta Ohlsson, my very dear colleague from NDI, for moderating our panel today. Birgitta, I think you're right. I think COP's incrementalism was on full display in Dubai. While there was agreement by all countries on a loss and damage fund that was going to be paid for by developed countries, it was going to provide financial support for the destruction underway as a result of climate change. Only 700 million was pledged when it's estimated that 400 billion per year is needed. We saw a much lauded first time ever pledge on fossil fuels, but that pledge was changed at the last minute from a phase out to a phase down, a transition, and not the much needed end of fossil fuel use. That said, I do think there were a few notable standouts from this COP. Some have called the global stocktake the heart of COP28, and the global stocktake was a 2-year assessment of how countries are doing with their first nationally determined commitments. The global stocktake concluded as COP in that the results were used to inform the negotiations and policies that were being developed in Dubai It is above all an accountability process, which we in the democracy and governance community love, these accountability systems. I think the other standout for me was actually an event that occurred before COP, which was the meeting between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden in Indonesia 2 weeks before the gathering in Dubai in November, where they issued a joint statement on the climate crisis and a pledge to stand up a joint working group on climate to exchange information and work on joint projects. We can only win when the two largest emitters agree to work together. And then finally, I think there was a growing realization, not new to those of us, I think, Hakima, in the democracy and governance world, but a growing realization at COP that governments simply are not up to the task of implementing large-scale mitigation and adaptation transformation. And I think this looming policy and governance gap is going to be a big part of our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Let's go to you, Hakima.
Thank you first, Birgitta, for moderating this panel, and I'm very happy that the cooperation between NDI and Liberal International is now focused also on climate change. And you know how close this issue to my heart, because I have established the Climate Justice Committee within Liberal International. Before any COP, you know, there are always high expectations, especially from the southern countries. Before any COP, I can tell you that the expectations are so high that any result in any COP, it's not always meeting the expectations of all the groups. A COP, it's 195 parties, so it's very difficult to make happy everyone. But let me tell you 4 things that were achieved in COP28. COP28, in fact, was 2 COPs. A COP of negotiation, the one we know and we used to know, and a COP where for the first time in the history of the COPs, the World Trade Organization organized the World Trade Fair and the World Trade House. And this is a huge, huge deal because this is related to greening economy, fair trade, a fair energy transition, etc. So in my opinion, that was a very good achievement in COP28. Second point, for the first time, after 28 years of negotiation, we are, without any complex, talking about fossil fuel. Fossil fuel sector is responsible of 75 to 90% of CO2 emissions, but no one was allowed, and it was taboo, it was tricky to talk about fossil fuel during the negotiation. This is the first year we did not only talk, but reach a consensus to go toward a phasing down of fossil fuel. Of course, many parties were disappointed, especially the small island, the global south in general, because we are talking about phase down and not phase out, but it was a huge step. Third point, we the first time and the first day of COP28, the loss and damage fund was operationalized. And this, personally, I was very well surprised, because that's unprecedented achievement. I agree with Lorraine. The amount of money, the pledges were very low. 700 million is not what is needed to tackle and to mitigate and to adapt to climate change in the global south. We need by far more than that. But that's the beginning. And as the president of COP28 said, of the UNFCCC said, that was the beginning of the end. We have now a mechanism which is loss and damage. What was not negotiated, and this is the wrinkle, I will say, was how we will implement the loss and damage. We heard that the loss and damage mechanism will be hosted in the World Bank. And believe me, this is not something which was very pleasant to the Global South, because we know how the World Bank will finance on a basis of loan the loss and damage mechanism. And for all the Global South, this is a question of not solidarity, but it's a question of justice. This is the mechanism of loss and damage is supposed to drive justice within the climate negotiation. So how, also what was not said, how are we going to phase down fossil fuel depending on the capacities on the countries, depending of the countries who are producer or not producer and are very dependent in their economies on oil and fossil fuel. So depending on the common and differentiated responsibility, which is the base and the core of the Paris Agreement. So I think that it was difficult to negotiate such thing during COP28, and I hope that COP29 will deliver on such thing. But generally, COP28 arrived in a moment where the stocktakes has demonstrated that we are far away from the objective of 1.5 degrees C, and that we didn't achieve enough to reach the objective. Indeed, we have decided in COP28 to triple the renewable energy, to double energy efficiency, but it's still not enough to reach and to be aligned with the objective of 1.5 degrees C of the Paris Agreement. So I will say my feeling is mitigate. We did a huge step, and this is, only 5 years are left to 2030 to decrease by 43% our CO2 emissions. Do we have time? We need time, we need visions, we need strategy, we need very strong political will.
Thank you so much, both Lauren and Hakima. And I wanted to stay with you a bit here, Hakima, because I mean, I know that from my former life as a liberal politician, I mean, your very strong passion for the countries, the global majority countries. And I mean, you've always been a long-standing champion for climate development, especially and aid to Africa in this area. And we saw, as you mentioned, that the COP28 kind of saw new financial commitments to Africa's climate resilience. I mean, including all these things that you mentioned, the public-private partnerships and the creating of the lasting damage funds. But is this enough, really? Is this enough?
You know, Africa is emitting only 3.8% of CO2 emissions and is facing the most, I will say, tragic impact of climate change. Africa has also the resources. Africa is the biggest reservoir of solar power. And financially, Africa is only receiving 3% of the financial flow of climate and only 2% of the financial flow oriented to renewable energy. So I think that Africa is not receiving what it deserves, not only to compensate the impact of climate change, but in terms of justice and fairness, Africa is not receiving at all what it deserves to be done. This is the first point. Second point, after, I would say, 10 years from the Paris Agreement, no promises who were respected. The $100 billion is not on the table. Capacity building is not on the table. The transparency mechanism is not on the table. The transfer of technology is not on the table. Adaptation has not received, and it was a promise of the COP20 in COP26. It was a promise to give adaptation as important as mitigation, but it's not yet done. CO2 emissions are in a constant increase instead of decreasing. And the most, I would say, frustrating decision that was taken in COP28 is that now, formally, in COP28, we recognize gas like energy of transition. So all this make us feel that the urgency of climate change, even though many pledges, many announcements, is not taken seriously into account by our leaders. So we need to do more, and our speed need to increase if we don't want to miss the rendezvous of the 1.5 degrees C in 2100.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hakima. I would like to direct myself now to you, Lauren. As you mentioned in your opening statement, you mentioned the global stocktake. I mean, that's kind of the first ever assessment of country progress on meeting their Paris Agreement commitments concluded COP28. And can you talk a bit more about the results of the stocktake and the impact it's having on the development of a new round of country national determined commitments due to in 2025? And if you could explain to the audience how the stocktakes work.
Yeah, no, thank you, Birgitta. I think Hakima and I both agreed that the stocktake was one of sort of the shining moments of COP, and it's a really positive development in the global governance of climate because it establishes an accountability system, and the accountability system is really around countries' NDCs, or nationally determined commitments. So the Paris Agreement was not only a collective commitment to pursue policies to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, but it also put in place a really highly rational governance system and planning principles. And at the core of the NDCs are NDCs, and that's simply a country's national climate action plan, how they're going to cut emissions, how they're going to adapt. The way it works is that each NDC, there are 5 years, and each following NDC is supposed to be successively more ambitious in building towards a country's long-term goals, which are supposed to be developing. And the global stocktake began in 2021 to assess how we're all doing against our nationally determined commitments. It was a massive data collection, then an analysis of the data, and as Hakima has said, a very disappointing, but probably not surprising conclusion that at the current rate of greenhouse gas reductions, and at the current rate of failure to implement our NDCs, we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees by a considerable amount. In fact, we're looking at a catastrophic temperature rise of 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. So we're now in the second round. Or for some countries, their third round of NDCs, and they're being developed now in 2023 and in 2024, and they're going to be submitted at COP30 at Rio. And these NDCs are supposed to be informed by the results of the stocktake. So let's talk a little bit about what this means, because despite the disappointing outcome, I think there's some moments here that we should all think about. There's an accountability moment here. Political parties, parliamentary representatives, Hakima, your organization with all its party affiliates can play a critical role now in the NDC process. They can exercise their oversight role to ask what happened to the first NDCs and why are targets not being achieved. They can ask in terms of the follow-on, the second round of NDCs, government, how are you going to position yourself for success in the next round? And they have an important role in achieving the next round of NDCs, codifying them, putting them into law, holding governments accountable for achieving them, and generating public awareness and advocacy. So political parties and elected parliamentary representatives really have a powerful role here that they need to seize. And the stocktake has given us the information for them to do that. And second, I also want to mention that because it's exactly as Hakima said, because of the failure of the first round of NDCs, this next round is going to have to be much more ambitious, which means we're going to start feeling the impact. So in addition to an accountability moment, I think we have a profound democracy strengthening moment. Their impacts are going to be felt, but in the past, there's been very little to prepare society, sectors, citizens, because they haven't been part of the NDC process. And we're seeing the results of that exclusion everywhere. We're seeing political backlash against green policies. We're seeing that in Europe right now as farmers protest against environmental regulations. Because of the lack of a participatory process around NDC, there's sort of a whiplash. We will see governments attempt to implement a policy. There'll be social or sectoral pushback, and governments will back down and cave in. And yet now, above all, is when we need really steady progress, ambitious progress against our NDCs. And frankly, one of the things that really concerns us is that there's gaps in NDC implementation and dissemination. So for example, in some of the assessments from Asia, knowledge of climate adaptation and mitigation is simply not reaching down to local levels of government, who are still implementing regulations on agriculture, infrastructure with no climate framing at all. So to me, it's really imperative, and this is what the global stocktake helps us do. It's imperative that the preparation of this next round of NDCs be super participatory, well beyond the consultations with the usual group of NGOs and well beyond capitals. This is an area where political parties and parliamentary representatives are critical. There needs to be more governance, architecture within countries, and participatory and deliberative processes built into NDCs. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say NDCs should be measured not just by their climate ambitions, but by the quality of the processes used in their development. So, and by quality, I mean how participatory they are, how accountability mechanisms are built into them, such as legislative oversight.
Yeah, I will maybe add something very important to what Lauren said. This is the next round of NDC will be the first of its kind with the CO2 emissions data. And this is very important for the transparency. We will know who is doing what and how. And I think that this is something which was many countries resisted to such information. And definitely, I agree with Lorraine. We need more inclusive NDC and more transparent in a way that we know who is emitting what and what is the roadmap to mitigate the CO2 emissions.
Thank you so much. And I also wanted to direct this question to continue up with you here, Hakima, because I mean, at Liberal International, you've been champions when it comes to pushing for progressive values in this area. So I mean, you have your climate justice committee that will deliver liberal answers to climate change. And I would like to, if you could elaborate and tell us, what would you say are the liberal answers to climate change from your perspective?
Let me tell you something. This year, 2024, 40% of the world population will vote. United States, Europe, etc. If we don't transform the agenda of climate change to a citizenship agenda, we will not succeed definitely. So the aim of the Climate Justice Committee is to make aware our political parties, our members. First, about the urgency. Second, about the fact that they are the one who are shaping the policies in their countries. They are the one who are deciding what kind of vision and strategies to implement in their countries to be aligned with the global transformation called for by the Paris Agreement. So the objective at the beginning was first to capacitate our members. You know, all the politicians are not aware about what is happening within the Paris Agreement. And as Laurence said, the first round of indices were not inclusive. So it was done maybe by the Minister of Environment, discussed with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, and that's it. Now what we need a citizenship agenda where the political parties are playing their role. Either they are in the cabinet or they are in the opposition. We need them to put a positive pressure on their government to design the right policies in their countries. That's the first. Second, so we are making capacity building. We are also issuing a policy paper on some themes which are problematic within the negotiation. Doing the fair transition, energy transition. What does it mean for the global South? It doesn't mean the same thing for the global North. So we are discussing together what, as liberals, we are seeing be the fair green transition. Migration, what is the statute, the legal statute of climate migration? Is there any statute for climate migration? We have now a paper concerning displacement and migration. Loss and damage. What is the liberal answer concerning loss and damage? How the least developed country and the global South should benefit of the loss and damage depending on their resources, if they are producer or not producer, etc., of oil, etc. So these are difficult questions which are not tackled in the arena of COP of the COPs, and which need a liberal trade committee. You know, we have now a free fair trade committee which is member of the WTO, and we were before COP28, which established the house, the fair trade, the trade fair house. We established this committee well before, and the objective was how to green the economy and the international trade, and how to make the global South benefit of the transfer of technology and green low carbon technologies in the trade agreement. This is something we have already done in our Fair Trade Committee. So as liberals and politicians, we think that we have the responsibility not only to participate in our own countries in shaping the policies, but to raise awareness and to speak with one voice, one liberal, strong, loud voice. And I personally, as president of Liberal International, sent and wrote many messages to the UN General Secretary. We launched the first campaign in 2018 of phasing out fossil fuel. That was the first campaign in its kind, launched in 2018 by Liberal International. And we called for all the parties to phase out fossil fuel and to cut subsidies. And this is something we are not talking about. $600 billion are subsidizing oil industry and oil in the world. And we are negotiating the Paris Agreement for 100 billion. So you can see here the imbalanced equation between subsidies and what the global south is asking for to tackle climate change. So I think that Liberal International, the Climate Justice Committee of Liberal International, is playing a very important role. We need to be louder. We need also more maybe partnership to be more outreach. And this partnership together with India, it's the beginning of maybe a very bright future for the Climate Justice Committee.
Thank you so much, Hakima. I just wanted to repeat to people that are listening right now to this webinar that if you have questions, you can please put them in the Q&A box. We already have some questions, but just wanted to kind of repeat the message. If you want to ask Lauren and Hakima questions, just put that in the box. We will wrap that a bit later during this webinar. But I wanted to ask you now again, Lauren. I mean, you have discussed during the session the potential backlash that we see. I mean, when it comes to the implementation of the next round of the NDCs. And just to explain again, the NDCs, that's the nationally determined contributions. So everyone knows again what we're talking about. It's a climate plan to cut emissions and to adapt to the climate impacts. And I want you to maybe discuss a bit what could be done to prevent that backlash that we're thinking of. I mean, a key theme of the COP28 was the governance gap and this kind of impact on achieving the climate commitments. And could you tell us a bit more about this governance gap and what could be done to address it?
So I want to say first, Birgitta, it's an excellent question. And I really think the governance gap and the backlash, the popular backlash, are actually related, right? That citizens, there's not a lot of transparency around what governments are doing. There's a sense that governments are failing in this department. And I think this is where the backlash stems from. And at COP, I went to a really great presentation by the Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency, which has launched this really innovative research, which is it's looking at and modeling environmental and economic modeling of more than 30 countries and looking at, you know, the feasibility of countries achieving net zero by 2050, which is, you know, one of the big commitments coming out of Glasgow. And they modeled different factors and their trade-offs. So they looked at technology, economics, geographics, institutions. And what they found was that for many countries, there are trade-offs that they can make to achieve these outcomes. That some countries can rely on different sets of technologies, others have different economic paths forward. So each country has a different path, but they have a path, except for one factor, which is institutions. That factor was shown as extremely weak. And if you don't have government capacity, there's not a trade-off. I mean, there's not an alternative path or choice. So the institutional gap is now identified as really the critical factor that stands in the way of climate adaptation and mitigation achievements, because other factors are realizable. So this, frankly, was an underlying panel, a theme of every panel that I attended at COP, but it was really underreported coming out of COP, that governments are not up to the mitigation and adaptation task. We at NDI see this every day and would actually categorize this as not just a governance gap, but frankly, a governance emergency. We have programs in Sri Lanka where the responsibility for the environment is split among multiple ministries, and the Ministry of the Environment has no overarching responsibility. So mitigation and adaptation efforts are fractured and vulnerable to corruption. In Lebanon, we have local governments trying to implement sustainability initiatives and local governments trying to stand up renewable energy at the local level. But absent a national regulatory framework to guide their initiatives, they really cannot achieve anything larger. And so in Bosnia, actually, it's the opposite. There's policy fragmentation on sustainability, too many levels of government with overlapping jurisdictions. It's paralyzing sustainability at the local level. So I think there needs to be a global stocktake of the governance gaps that are making this entire enterprise of climate mitigation and adaptation unfeasible, as the Netherlands Institute found. And we really need to put institutional strengthening and governance in innovation at the heart of climate action.
Thank you. I want to direct this next question to both of you, Hakima and Lauren. So, I mean, all of these big climate conference, there is obviously a focus very much on governments and on parliaments, what they can and what they should do. But as we all know, I mean, political parties are represented both in governments and parliaments, and there will be no kind of climate progress without progressive political parties that are prepared to take the next step and brave steps for saving the planet. And as you mentioned, Hakima, at ELA, you have the Climate and Justice Committee. And our organization, NDI, we have initiated this environmental governance and resilience programs. And I want to ask you both, I mean, why is democracy promotion so kind of critical to climate adaptation and mitigation? And what do we need to do to better integrate our work with that of environmental and climate groups, the civil society, and what is the role for political parties in all of these things? Who would like to start?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, democracy. You are. Thank you for this question, because when we are talking about climate change, sometimes we forget about all the values: democracy, freedom, freedom of speech, civil society. And this is a very, very important issue, because when you are in a democratic system, you have a voice. And it's why I was talking about the voters this year. The voters can decide which government, which leaders they will choose to manage their future. So when you are in a democratic system, you have a voice, and your voice means something. And for this challenge we are facing today, each voice is important to make us close the gap and reach and be closer to the 1.5 degrees C. And it's why it's very important that this is what I was saying, that we transform this climate agenda, which is a multilateral convention, multilateral talk, to a citizenship agenda where each individual, each person has the right to express herself or himself, to give his opinion about the politic, because the politic are the one who are shaping the future. So political parties have a huge responsibility to shape the policies. And you know that everything is related to the policies. Why do we have this problem of governance? Because until 2000, I will say 15, the climate change agenda and the climate change negotiation was in between the hands of ministers of environment. These are not the most powerful ministers in all the cabinets of the world. So this is an agenda which needs a strategic vision of the whole country, the president of the country, the prime minister of the country. And what I did when I was Minister of Environment, what it was done first by His Majesty the King Mohammed VI, a charter of sustainable development in Morocco. When I became minister, I transformed this charter to a law of sustainability in Morocco. And this law was binding all the ministries to have 3 pillars. First, climate change is a pillar, is in the core of all the strategies all the visions, all the policies. Second, green economy, and third, biodiversity and sustainability. So it's by far bigger than the portfolio of a Minister of Environment. So what we need democratic I understand what is behind the question, and we have had a COP in the Emirates, now Azerbaijan. The next one is Brazil, and I understand that we need to encourage in this worried world where authoritarians are increasing, populists are increasing. We need to make sure, and this is what Liberal International is doing, what NDI is doing, to empower democratic parties and progressist parties to make our values in the baseline of all the policies. So yes, definitely, democracy is very important to give voice to all of us and to each individual.
Lauren.
Thank you, Birgitta. So, I mean, Hakima and I both discussed how, the next NDCs and the subsequent rounds of NDCs are going to be extremely transformational and really stressful to democratic governments. They're going to have to determine political and economic winners and losers. There's going to be a lot of governance transformation, new laws, rewritten regulations, and really hard political decisions like who is going to pay for all of this, and who is going to benefit from all of this, and who is going to lose from all of this. And so, I cannot emphasize enough that given these stressful transitions that we are going to have to undergo, democracy, it really is the only system that can deliver the transparency and accountability that's going to achieve the greater public support for these transitions, to prevent that backlash. And responding to climate change is going to require, just as Hakima said, like collective action from citizens, which really only democracies can deliver on. One of the things I worry about, Hakima talks about sort of the authoritarian, wave that's going on. But I think there's also, a huge criticism, of environmental progress today, in that there's really been a lot of, even among democracies, right, a lot of preference for highly technocratic top-down solutions, for extra legal approaches, because they can deliver faster. And yet we're seeing politically that that's not the case. We're seeing the backlash. We're seeing the uneven applications of policy. And so we at NDI actually think that, democracy is not only necessary for climate action, but we're pretty excited about the opportunities that climate offers for democracy strengthening and renewal. We're seeing young people, a generation of young people that were disaffected from politics, now engaging in political processes. We are seeing citizens leveraging their government's commitments to climate to create more civil society space, pushing back on the closing civic space. We're seeing a renewal of democratic action at the local level. Communities feel environmental impacts. They're mobilizing around them. And we're seeing coalitions of coalitions. So a gathering of anti-corruption, environmental, gender rights groups, youth groups, even the private sector, which is beginning to align with civil society to hold governments accountable for climate risk. So the list really goes on, but I'd like to conclude by saying that democracy is not only vital to delivering the quality of government that we're going to need, but climate really offers democracy and governance supporters real opportunities for innovation and renewal.
Thank you both. And one last question before we go to the Q&A from our listeners here today. But just talking about the authoritarians that you both mentioned, I mean, last week Freedom House launched their latest Freedom in the World report. And like always, it's unfortunately devastating reading. I mean, the global freedom declined for the 18th consecutive year in 2023. The breadth and depth of the deterioration were very extensive. When it comes to political rights and civil liberties, they diminished in, I think, 52 countries and improved in only 21. And we know that the COP28 UN Climate Change Conference was held in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates, and this year the COP29 will be held in Baku, Azerbaijan. And both the United Arab Emirates and Azerbaijan, they are rated as not free in the Freedom in the World 2024 Freedom's annual study. And I want to ask you, Lauren and Hakima, what kind of implications do you think on the climate change debate would you say this be having the authoritarian and dictatorship countries arranging the climate change conferences? I mean, in countries, for example, as Azerbaijan, where the formal opposition, they've been weakened by years of persecution, and in the United Arab Emirates, political parties are practically banned. How is that really affecting upon the climate change debate?
Thank you, Birgitta, for highlighting this point. Let me tell you something. A climate change conference is a multilateral event. It's not the property of the country, which is only the host. The country is hosting a multilateral event. So all the parties are equal in the UNFCCC arena. And if one of them is candidate to host climate change conference, he is hosting the climate change conference. Yes, indeed, organizing a climate change conference is putting the country in the center of the world, communication, diplomacy, etc., giving the country opportunities to sign agreements on many things. But if we look at the negotiation stream, then the agenda is already fixed, and I don't think the country can have any, I would say, bad influence on what the output of the COP. Let's take the Emirate example, for example. We have achieved in the Emirate what we have never achieved in a COP. The loss and damage mechanism, the registration of the CO2 emission within the national contribution stocktake, the tripling the renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency by 2030, etc. So the output was not bad. So I think that we should keep in mind that for the first time, and I'm not, I was confused at the beginning what to think about organizing a COP in an oil producer country. But let me tell you the truth. The truth is that 20% of the world countries are producing 80% of CO2 emissions, and 100 companies in the world are producing 80% of CO2. And these 100 companies in the world are oil producer companies. So this is our opportunity to put them in front of their responsibilities to deliver on climate change and to deliver on the decrease of CO2 emissions. So yes, you are right. This is a very important question. And as party members of the UNFCCC, we should keep in mind that no impact of the, I will say, the democratic space of the host country should impact the negotiation.
I will very briefly add to Hakima's really, really powerful points here. And I know we want to leave space for questions as well. But I agree with Hakima, first hosting a COP in a country like Azerbaijan not only bring sort of multilateral commitments, but the international civil society will still continue to have an impact on the COP negotiations and on the conduct of COP. And we've already seen that in the sense that Azerbaijan announced an all-male COP29 committee, and after protests and attention by international civil society, the board was reconstituted and included 12 women.
12 women, exactly, yes.
So there is latitude here. And then I really want to pick up on Hakima's point, that really COPs are the only place where the most vulnerable countries have a seat at the table, and it forces emitters and fossil fuel producers like Azerbaijan to sit across from the table and listen to countries like Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea and listen to what it means if they don't act. And it's a place where climate vulnerability or agendas are heard and elevated. So I just think, like Hakima, where the COP is held is not necessarily as important as what it can achieve. So.
And let me add something very important. That now with this war between, or the aggression of Russia to Ukraine, Azerbaijan has the plan to double its production of gas and to export to Europe. So that will be the place when we have to advocate for phasing down production and phasing down export of gas and implementing renewable energy policies. So I think that such kind of location might open a window of advocacy for what we are aiming, because beside the oil producers and beside the oil consumers, you have civil society, you have government, you have the least developed country, you have the small island, you have the global south, which is very vulnerable to climate change and which is insisting to have the right measures and actions to mitigate climate change and to adapt itself. Final thing I want to say, if there is a wish for me for COP29, I will say to all the leaders of this world that maybe we need a very strong political will and one second time to take a decision to stop a war. But we need more than one generation to implement the global transformation and to implement action to mitigate the already existing impact of climate change. So the priorities should be reviewed during this COP.
Thank you so much, both. We only have 6 minutes left and we have 3 questions in the chat. So I'm actually going to read them all. And I think the first one is directed to you, Hakima, but I'll read them all and then I will ask you to kind of answer brief to the questions, okay? So the first one is from Salman Mustafa from the Iraqi Kurdistan region, and he's asking you, Hakima, you touched a bit upon this already, but what is the liberal international strategy and stance on climate change, particularly in COP28? And do you believe that negotiations and events like COP are effective in safeguarding our global environment and climate? So that's from Salman Mustafa, Iraqi Kurdistan. And then we have 2 more questions that are to both of you. And the first one is around, we've seen a rise of right-wing populism and climate skepticism in Europe. And at the same time, Trump is possibly the person who's writing here, getting elected in America. How do these factors play in the upcoming COP meetings, and what effect would that have? And then the last question from our listeners: how do COP concretely implement the agreements on decreasing fossil fuels, and what are the measures taken, for example, on regulating global companies? So big questions, but I ask you to be brief. Who would like to start?
Lauren, myself, okay?
Yes.
Yes, please, Hakima.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all for the questions. I will begin by Mustafa. Mustafa, negotiations, are they helping in safeguarding our environment? I will not say no, but definitely not a yes. I think that these negotiations are very important, first to increase awareness among our politicians. Let me tell you a confidence. When I was Minister of Environment, many ministers of many sectors were not aware about the issue of climate change. Bringing them to COP and letting them discuss with the other ministers, with the coalitions, etc., open their eyes and their ears and allow them to imagine how they can integrate climate change issue in their policies and their ministries. When we are talking about climate change, it's in fact we are talking about people, and we are talking about a global transformation in all the sectors, beginning by building, transportation, energy, culture, education, everything. So this is really a global transformation. So we need everybody on board, and this arena of negotiation, for me, it's not the most important thing. The most important output of a COP, it's what is happening after you come back from a COP. When you come back to your country, what you are implementing, how do you change the vision of the country, the strategy of the country, the policies? Because when you change the policy of the country, you give a signal to the investors, to the private sector. So these things are extremely important. And if you are not within this arena, you cannot understand the full picture. So I think that COPs are a multilateral system which is important, not always delivering, I agree, but very important environment to maintain in order to maintain the momentum. What Liberal International is doing is trying exactly to do that, to make our parties and our members aware about the fact that they need the vision, they need the strategy, they need the policies, and they need coherency in their policies. Because if you continue to subsidize fossil fuel, you don't need to have a strategy on renewable energy. It will never be competitive. So you need to have a certain coherency, and this is what we are doing. We are trying to capacitate them and to make them, and we are sharing experience and sharing good visions. The second thing, question which is very, very important concerning the votes, and this is what I was saying at the beginning of this meeting. Yes, 40% of the population of the world will vote in 2024, and each vote is important. Donald Trump elected in the United States. Will this election impact the climate negotiation? Of course, yes. Of course, yes. United States is one of the biggest emitter of CO2 emission in the world, and the policy of United States is impacting the world. So definitely yes, and it's why it's very important that we make aware the American citizens, the European citizens also, that their voice will shape the policy of climate change of tomorrow. So yes, you are right, it's very important. And the last question.
I think we need to go to Lauren now because we are almost running out of time. So Lauren, if you would like to give an answer to that one.
No, I think we should have ended with Hakima's frankly.
Okay.
That was very nice. I will just add one very small point. You know, Hakima talks about this coherence and this rationalization. And, you know, we focus a lot on the fossil fuel countries and all, but there really needs to be a hard discussion on the consumers of fossil fuels. Azerbaijan was selected because it filled a capacity for Europe, you know, in terms of its fuel needs, you know, with regard to scaling down on Russia. So I think there needs to be a more rational discussion of exactly what the phase down looks like for countries that are moving to renewables, and a communication to countries that are fossil fuel producers. That's all I'll add.
Just one
Yes.
sentence about the last question, because it's a very important question. How do COP concretely implement the agreement on decreasing fossil fuel? We don't know yet. And this is very important. This is what I was saying at the beginning of this meeting. We need to know how, especially how we will implement this phasing down of fossil fuel in the developing world, that which their economies are very dependent on fossil fuel. So we need to scale up finance to support them in phasing down oil. And this is something we didn't decide yet, and we didn't negotiate yet in the COP.
Yes. Thank you so much, both, and also Hakima, you can read in the Q&A a very nice shout out to you from our Kurdish colleague here, Salman Mustafa, that we need more people, leaders like Ms. Hakima al-Haiti, pushing for strong passion around climate. I just wanted to ask you both very, very, very short, if you would. We're in a liberal international context here, so we should be positive and we should think about positive things and progressive things. So if you would like to give us just one hopeful takeaway that you see now with the COP29, what are like the best things, the most positive takeaway that you would have? Would you like to start, Lauren?
Lauren?
I don't think mine is around COP29. I'd just like to say that I really appreciate the growing sort of citizen awareness around climate and the real activism here. And just a plea to politicians or liberal international leaders on this call that, you know, we use terms like greenlash and we use terms like pushback, but really this is democratic awakening. And I think we really need to begin to think of this as a real positive way to engage with citizens on the solutions that are going to matter to them.
Thank you. Last words from you, Hakima.
You know, each COP, we are going to each COP with a lot of hope and expectation. But in these last 2 years, the world is witnessing wars and instability, insecurity everywhere. I hope that during this COP29, leaders of this world will be aware about the urgency of climate change, and will decide to review the priorities, because the priority, as I said, is not war. That we cannot implement the energy transition or the ecology transition in instability and wars. So I hope that we will decide finally that the priority of humanity is not war, but tackling climate change and implementing the Paris Agreement.
That was very wise words from Hakima al-Haiti, who's the president of Liberal International. I also wanted to thank my colleague from NDI, Lauren Metre, that is leading our team that is working very passionate around resilience and climate, and also Irene Wang from the Liberal International, running all the logistics around this seminar. And the webinar will be posted and recorded, so you can listen and you can share among friends to continue this very important debate. And thanks everyone that listened for being part of this. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.